Hello, glad to see you on the channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and don't forget to write a comment. Enjoy watching.
When my mom looked me dead in the eye and said, "You'll always live in your sister's shadow," something in me didn't snap, didn't break, didn't even flinch. Instead, something finally shifted into place. Like the last click of a puzzle piece that had been turning in my head for over 4 decades, and in that eerie silence that followed her words, I smiled, stood up slowly, took out the trash like I always did, and left without saying a single word. Not because I was too stunned to reply, but because I had run out of reasons to stay in that house, or in that role I never auditioned for, but had been cast in since the moment Claire was born, with dimples and an effortless ability to make people adore her. Growing up, I knew Claire wasn't the problem. It wasn't her fault. She was the kind of daughter who made the other moms on the block say things like, "You must be so proud," while my mom would just nod politely and say, "Well, Claire's always had that spark." Like I was some dimly lit bulb flickering in the background, too busy reading in my room or quietly getting straight as to be noticed, never mind praised. I wasn't the kind of kid who demanded attention. I didn't throw tantrums. I didn't break curfews. I didn't even date in high school, and maybe that was the problem. Maybe I was too easy to overlook, too reliable to be interesting, too silent to be special. Claire, on the other hand, seemed to absorb the oxygen in every room we entered together. If I brought home an art project I'd worked on for a week, she'd come running in behind me with a broken shoelace and tears in her eyes, and suddenly I was forgotten in the doorway, holding papier-mâché that sagged like my heart. When she turned 13, Mom threw her a party with pink streamers and a karaoke machine, and I remember watching her from the kitchen, where I helped refill the punch bowl, while everyone else watched Claire belt out some pop song like she was born for a stage that none of us knew existed until she stepped on it. My own 13th birthday had been 3 years earlier. No party, no singing, just a store-bought cake with Rachel spelled wrong and a half-hearted hug before Mom left to drive Claire to gymnastics. And yet, I kept trying. Not for applause, I had long given up on that, but for some kind of acknowledgement that I wasn't just the understudy in someone else's play. I cleaned up after every family dinner, even when Claire showed up late and left early. I drove Mom to her doctor appointments when Claire was too swamped with patients. I remembered anniversaries, mailed birthday cards to relatives we barely talked to, made sure Mom's fridge was stocked every time I visited. Claire would FaceTime once a month, maybe less. But she was still the busy one, the successful one, the one doing important things, while I was, what exactly? "So good to her mother," said in that tone that dripped with pity rather than pride. By the time we were adults, the script had already hardened. Claire, the beautiful, brilliant dentist with a husband who is some kind of surgeon, oncology, I think, though honestly I've never been sure because we've never had a conversation that lasted more than 3 minutes. And two perfect children who wore matching outfits in every Christmas card. Me? Divorced, no kids. Living alone in a condo I bought myself after years of saving in a job I didn't love but was good at, HR, where people cry in your office and expect you to fix things you didn't break. I had a cat named Felix who was allergic to everything, including himself, and I spent more Friday nights organizing my spice rack than going out. Still, I made time for Mom. Still, I called. Still, I showed up. So when she said those words, "You'll always live in your sister's shadow," she wasn't telling me anything I didn't already know. She was just saying it out loud for the first time, with no shame, no hesitation, and not even the grace to pretend it hurt her to admit it. That was the part that stunned me, the ease with which she delivered the blow, as if she were stating a fact like the weather, or the price of milk, or the time of day. I didn't say anything, because what was there to say? Arguing would have been like yelling at a wall for not being a window. She had made her choices long ago, carved her opinions into stone, and I had spent most of my life standing in front of that monument, hoping it would one day soften. It hadn't. It wouldn't. So I smiled, not because I was okay, but because I was finally done pretending to be. I walked into the kitchen, picked up the bag of trash that was already tied and ready, and stepped out into the cold evening air like I was stepping out of a costume I'd worn for too long. I remember the way the door clicked behind me, soft, final, not dramatic like in the movies. Just a door closing. Just a chapter ending. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, I've ignored the calls, the voicemails, the texts that started off sharp, "You're being dramatic, come home," and slowly turned pleading, "Let's talk, are you okay?" Claire has messaged me twice. The first time, she asked if I was mad about something. The second time, yesterday, she wrote, "What did you say to her?" She's a mess. I haven't answered. Because the truth is, I didn't say anything. Not really. But maybe silence speaks louder than I ever could. There's a peculiar kind of silence that doesn't arrive all at once, like a storm or a scream, but instead builds gradually over years, seeping into the walls of a house, into the pauses between conversations, into the spaces where warmth should have lived. Until it becomes a kind of wallpaper, familiar, unnoticed, yet always there, and that's the silence I return to on what would unknowingly become my last evening in my mother's house as her other daughter, the quiet one, the background one, the shadow. It had been a Thursday, chilly but not unbearable, the kind of evening where the sky dims slowly, almost tenderly, and the sound of tires on the gravel driveway makes you feel like maybe something is about to change, although in that moment, I couldn't have known that change had already begun the moment I decided to bring over dinner, like I always did, reheated chicken Alfredo from the deli section, Mom's favorite, though she always called it a little bland, as if her approval was forever 2 degrees out of reach, like the light on a fridge you can't quite shut all the way. I had walked in without knocking, like I had done for years, since she never bothered to lock the door, and I placed the plastic containers on the counter, already knowing she'd be sitting in her recliner, sipping from her dented wine glass, watching a rerun of some crime show she'd seen 20 times, the kind where women get murdered and men get praised for figuring out who did it, even though the clues are obvious and the victims are never given names that matter. She barely looked up when I came in, just raised her hand in a vague wave, her eyes glued to the screen like justice might finally surprise her if she kept watching long enough. I didn't expect much, hadn't for years, so I moved through the kitchen on autopilot, arranging the food on plates she never helped wash, setting the table she never offered to clear, telling myself that love, in this house, had always looked like maintenance. Acts of service done in silence, like folding someone else's laundry and hoping they notice you still exist. We ate without talking much. She criticized the sauce, said it tasted microwaved, even though it hadn't been, and I nodded, because I had learned over the years that arguing about food was just code for something else, disappointment, dissatisfaction, maybe regret. But not regret in the way most people understand it, more like resentment that I had turned out to be a woman she couldn't show off at book club, a woman whose success wasn't easily photographed, whose name didn't spark admiration when mentioned at the hair salon. It wasn't until we were done eating, the dishes still on the table, the kitchen dim except for the flickering under-cabinet lights, that she finally said it, out of nowhere, as if the thought had just occurred to her, and she felt compelled to share it like a weather report. "You know, you'll always live in your sister's shadow." The words didn't land like a bomb or a slap. They landed like dust on an old photograph, confirmation of something faded but real, something already known and catalogued, but still capable of dull pain. I remember the way she sipped her wine afterward, her eyes not even on me, as if what she had said was a kindness, a truth I should have already accepted, a sentence meant to be freeing, not cruel. I didn't respond. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just stood up slowly, walked to the kitchen, tied the trash bag with a practiced hand, and stepped outside into the early darkness, where the sky had turned a flat, bruised purple and the air smelled faintly of wet leaves and final chances. The trash bin creaked when I lifted the lid, a sound so mundane and unremarkable that it felt almost theatrical in its symbolism, like the closing of a chapter in a story no one else had bothered to read. What I didn't do was return. I didn't go back inside to gather my things. I didn't hug her goodbye or ask her to explain herself. I walked to my car, slid into the driver's seat, and sat there for a moment, letting the silence settle like a second skin. Then I turned the key, pulled out of the driveway, and drove 5 hours north without stopping, not because I had anywhere specific to go, but because I needed to be somewhere else, anywhere else, where I could breathe without inhaling a lifetime of quiet disappointment. For the next several days, I let the phone ring. I let the voicemails pile up. I watched the texts come in first from Mom, then from Claire. The messages were short, confused, mildly accusatory in that way families do best. Are you okay? What's going on? You're being really childish. Then, call me Rachel. Please. Then, I didn't mean it that way. I didn't respond. Not because I wanted to hurt her, but because I finally understood that silence was the only language she had never learned to interpret, the only answer she couldn't manipulate into something more flattering for herself. For once, I wasn't giving her anything, no explanation, no forgiveness, no performance of the dutiful daughter. And then, after days of nothing, my phone buzzed at 3 in the morning. It wasn't Mom. It was Claire. 4 words. What did you say? No context. No greeting. Just that. And in that moment, I realized something had shifted not in me, but in them. Something had cracked. Something had been disturbed. And for the first time in my life, I had been the one to move the needle. Without screaming. Without accusing. Without even trying. I had taken out the trash and somehow, without saying a single word, I'd left the house cleaner than I'd ever found it. There's something deeply unsettling about being unreachable, not in the sense of someone losing your number or not knowing where you live, but in the deeper, more unnerving way where you stop making yourself available to be hurt, to be needed, to be leaned on or lectured or pitted or praised in ways that never felt real. And when I made the quiet decision to withdraw from the familiar rituals of appeasement that had ruled my relationship with my mother and, to a lesser extent, with Claire, I wasn't trying to send a message or ignite chaos or reclaim some imagined power. I simply stopped showing up in places where I had been expected to play the same predictable part, and in doing so, I became something far more powerful than angry. I became unpredictable. The first few days after I disappeared from the script were both terrifying and liberating in the way that only change, real change, ever is. I turned off my phone, not because I didn't want to hear their voices, but because I already knew exactly what they'd sound like. My mother would start off sharp, wounded in the way only a self-righteous person can be when their authority is silently revoked, saying things like, "You need to grow up," or "Don't be dramatic," and Claire, if she chimed in at all, would do so with that polished detachment she'd mastered over the years, the kind where concern is laced with condescension, the tone of someone who hasn't ever had to look at a family photo and wonder what part of it they were allowed to occupy. In that stretch of silence, those wide, untouched days, I didn't do anything radical or cinematic. I didn't take a solo trip to a mountaintop or burn old photos or scream into the void. Instead, I went back to my condo, watered my plants, took Felix to the vet because he'd been sneezing more than usual, cleaned out my closets, and reorganized the junk drawer in the kitchen, not because I was trying to distract myself, but because after years of managing my mother's emotions like some unpaid intern, it felt bizarre and beautiful to do small things for myself without needing them to be acknowledged, measured, or repaid. I did call my therapist, though. Her name's Joan, and she's got this voice that sounds like it's been weathered by too many decades of other people's stories, which is oddly comforting, like she's heard every version of every heartbreak and still believes people are worth listening to. I didn't say much in that first session, just told her what my mother said, what I didn't say in return, and what I'd done afterward. And she sat quietly for a moment before saying something that lodged itself into my chest like a pin holding a note to a corkboard. Sometimes, she said, not reacting is the clearest form of protest. And that was the phrase that stayed with me, the one that echoed every time I saw my phone light up with yet another missed call from Mom, or a half-hearted, "Are you okay?" from Claire that somehow sounded more suspicious than sincere. I hadn't planned anything, hadn't constructed some elaborate revenge, or staged a family rebellion. I had simply exited the room, the way you do when someone's talking at you instead of to you, and it turns out, when someone loses the person they've spent decades belittling, ignoring, or taking for granted, their world doesn't collapse immediately, it tilts, shifts slowly, and then, without warning, begins to unravel in ways you couldn't possibly orchestrate, even if you tried. Claire's second message had come 2 nights after the first. Seriously. What did you say to her? I hadn't said anything to anyone. But apparently, that silence had spoken louder than 1,000 arguments ever could, and now, something had rippled across the perfectly still surface of our family's performance. I could feel it in the way the messages started to change. My mother had gone from hurling guilt-laced barbs, "After all I've done for you," to something shakier, more fragile, messages that said, "We should talk, and I don't know what's going on, but I'm worried," which was almost laughable in its irony. Because I'd spent my entire life wondering why she wasn't more worried about me, about the ways she chipped at me until I learned to stop expecting softness. And then came the posts, little breadcrumbs on social media, so carefully curated they might as well have come with captions like, "Everything's fine, look how fine we are," photos of Claire and her kids at the zoo, my mother smiling too widely. The kind of strained smile that doesn't reach the eyes, as though someone had told her to look happy but didn't give her the script. It was obvious, to anyone paying attention, that something was wrong, but what none of them could figure out was what, and that was the part one hadn't even planned, the mystery of my silence, the void I'd left behind that no one could fill with explanations. Because for once, I wasn't giving them one. And perhaps the cruelest, or maybe the most poetic thing I did during that time, was post a photo, not of myself, not of anyone in my family, but of a handwritten note I'd found while cleaning out a box of old letters. It was from my mother, dated nearly 2 decades ago, written in her tidy, looping cursive on a floral card, congratulating Claire on her dental school acceptance. But the part that mattered was the second line, "I always knew you'd make something of yourself." I hadn't captioned the photo. I hadn't said a word. I just posted it, black and white, stark and unedited, and within hours, the comments poured in: old friends, distant relatives, people from church, "Wow, so proud, that's beautiful." And then, buried deep among the noise, came a private message from Claire. "What game are you playing?" I didn't reply. Because it wasn't a game. It was just the first time I decided to stop participating in one. The silence, it turns out, had teeth. And they were starting to bite. There's a certain flavor of dissent that doesn't look like panic or fury or open breakdowns, but rather resembles something slower, more deliberate, almost elegant in its unraveling, like watching a silk thread being pulled from the hem of an old dress. At first, barely noticeable, but eventually impossible to ignore, and that's exactly how it began with my mother after I disappeared from her weekly rhythm, not with screaming or shouting, but with the suffocating realization that the one person who had always been within reach, always willing to return with arms full of grocery bags and half-finished forgiveness, was no longer playing the role she had come to rely on. Aunt Doris called me on a Sunday morning, her voice the kind of soft that comes from decades of choosing diplomacy over truth, and she didn't waste time pretending this was just a check-in, didn't bother with pleasantries or small talk. She just said, "Your mother's been asking about you," not in the usual way. I didn't respond at first, just let her words stretch into the quiet of my apartment, where Felix purred on the windowsill and the scent of burnt toast still hung in the air, and when I finally did speak, I asked the question that had been growing louder in my head with each passing day. Did she ever love me, Doris? Or was it just convenience? There was a pause, long and telling, and then Doris sighed in that way that only older women sigh, the kind of breath that holds everything you don't want to say, but no longer have the energy to keep buried. She loved you, she said, but she didn't know how to show it without comparing you to someone she already decided was better. That sentence, if I'm honest, didn't hurt the way I expected it to. It didn't shatter anything or split me open. It just confirmed a suspicion I'd carried for so long it had become a fact. The same way you stop looking for treasure once you realize the map was drawn for someone else. What I didn't expect, though, was what came next. Doris, almost like she was confessing on someone's behalf, told me something I hadn't known, a detail small on the surface, but massive in implication. That when I had applied to an art school in New York at age 17, my one act of rebellion, my one attempt to carve out something entirely mine, my mother had intercepted the acceptance letter and convinced me not to go, citing finances, safety, and vague concerns about the kind of people who go into the arts. But what she never said, what Doris revealed to me that morning, was that Claire had also applied to an out-of-state program around the same time and hadn't been accepted, and my mother, unable to stomach the idea of her less favored daughter leaving first, shining first, had quietly decided that no one would. I sat with that for a long time. Not in anger, not even in shock, but in a kind of stillness that felt like grief, grieving the life I could have lived, the choices I didn't get to make because someone else was too small to let me be big. And yet, I wasn't surprised. If anything, I was impressed by how consistent she had been in her sabotage, how elegantly she had disguised her cruelty as caution, her control as care. That same day, my phone buzzed again. Not a call this time, but a photo sent by Claire. It was a blurry image of our mother sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of old VHS tapes and dusty photo albums, her hands clutched together like she was praying or pleading, though for what, I couldn't guess. The message that came with it was short, as if Claire had typed it quickly and without thought. She's been like this for days. Watching old tapes. Crying. Saying things don't line up. I stared at the photo for a long time, not because it moved me, but because it was so bizarre to see my mother out of control, untethered from the authority she had wrapped around herself like armor for years. She looked small in that image, not frail, but reduced, like someone who had been confronted with a version of the past that didn't cooperate with the narrative they had carefully curated. And maybe, just maybe, my silence had opened a door in her mind she couldn't close, a door that led to all the moments she had edited out of her memory. My awards, my heartbreaks, the dinners she never attended, the birthdays she forgot, the proud moments she had tossed aside because they didn't fit into the myth of Claire. Later that week, another call from Doris confirmed the spiral was deepening. She asked if I think you hate her, Doris said quietly, and I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so absurd, the idea that my mother, who had made me question my worth with surgical precision, was now struggling with the absence of something she had never truly valued. I didn't answer her question. Instead, I asked another, did she ever apologize for what she did? Doris paused. Not in words, she said. But this is the closest I've ever seen her come. Still, I didn't call. I didn't text. I didn't post another photo. I let the silence grow, not out of vengeance, but out of necessity, because once you start breathing fresh air, you can't go back to rooms where the oxygen is laced with guilt and invisible terms. Then, one night, just past midnight, Claire called. I let it ring. Then a second time. On the third attempt, I picked up. What the hell did you do? She asked, her voice cracked at the edges, not angry, not accusing, just lost. She won't talk to me about it, but she's unraveling. She says she doesn't remember things clearly. She's asking if she was a bad mother. And in that moment, something inside me shifted again, not with joy or satisfaction, but with a kind of quiet vindication I hadn't even known I was seeking. I hadn't said anything. I hadn't yelled, exposed her, or weaponized the truth. I had just stopped pretending. I had stopped playing. And now the stage was collapsing. All I said to Claire before I hung up was this: sometimes the truth doesn't show up as a scream. Sometimes it shows up when the mirror stops lying. And in the silence that followed, I realized I wasn't in her shadow anymore. I had become the light she couldn't ignore. There is a very particular kind of ending that doesn't announce itself with thunder or spectacle, that doesn't slam doors or erupt in one final, sweeping confrontation, but rather arrives quietly, like a tide retreating from the shore, so slowly and imperceptibly that you barely notice what's changed until you're standing in a place you no longer recognize, dry-footed and clear-eyed, staring at a space that once held your drowning. And for me, that ending came not with a declaration, not with closure in the way the self-help books promise, but with the stark simplicity of a morning drive and the knowledge that I no longer needed to be heard, believed, or even forgiven to finally be free. It had been several weeks since Claire's last call, the one where her voice cracked through the phone like she was holding back more than she wanted to reveal, where she asked, with the kind of fear usually reserved for strangers, what I had done to our mother, not physically. Of course, not even emotionally in the traditional sense, but what I had said, What I had dropped into the silence that could have possibly unraveled a woman who had been so secure in her role as gatekeeper of the family. Narrative: a woman who had spent decades scripting our lives to center around one child while casting the other as audience, as afterthought, as utility. And the honest answer, which I never gave her out loud, was that I had done the only thing left for someone who had tried everything else. I had withdrawn. I had stopped defending myself, stopped offering explanations or arguments or well-reasoned pleas for recognition, and I had simply left behind the version of myself they were comfortable ignoring. I had become a void in their carefully maintained illusion, and in doing so, I had forced them to confront the shape of what was missing. It's easy to dismiss a child's complaints when that child is still doing the dishes and taking out the trash and driving over with hot meals and oil changes and a stack of freshly printed photos no one asked for. It's easy to pretend nothing is wrong when the person you've hurt most is the one still holding the family together like invisible glue. But when that glue dissolves, when the quiet one goes quiet for real, then the picture starts to peel off the wall, then the cracks in the frame become impossible to ignore. I hadn't planned to go back. Not really. But curiosity has its own pulse, and one morning, as autumn began to paint the city in its final, aching oranges and rusts, I found myself driving toward my mother's neighborhood, not out of duty, not to rescue or repair or redeem, but to observe. Like someone revisiting a house they once lived in, not to reclaim it, but to make sure they made the right decision when they left the keys behind. When I turned onto her street, I slowed the car without realizing it, my fingers hovering near the hazard lights, as if I were pulling up to a scene of quiet devastation. The house looked the same: red brick, overgrown bushes, faded wind chimes that clattered faintly in the breeze, but it didn't feel the same. It no longer felt like a place I was meant to enter, only one I had finally escaped from. I parked across the street, engine off, hands resting in my lap, and waited. I didn't know what I expected. Maybe to see her shuffling to the mailbox, or staring out the window like some ghost of her former self, or maybe just existing in a way that confirmed she was still capable of doing so without me, but instead, I saw the front door open, slowly and without urgency, and my mother stepped out into the sunlight, barefoot, holding a mug with both hands like it was the only thing keeping her upright. She stood there for a long moment, scanning the street, her eyes unfocused and searching, not panicked, not theatrical, but hollow in a way that startled me, and I realized then that she wasn't looking for me specifically. She was looking for something that had always been there before and now simply wasn't. I didn't wave. I didn't roll down the window or flash my lights. I just sat there, half shadowed by the branches above, completely still, entirely unseen. Eventually, she turned, stepped back inside, and closed the door behind her, not with force or hesitation, but with the kind of tired acceptance that follows after you finally admit to yourself that what's lost isn't coming back the way it used to be. And in that small, wordless moment, I felt the final stitch unravel, not violently, but with a softness that made it all the more final. Later that night, I would get one last text from Claire. No accusations. No riddles. Just 4 words: she's not the same. I didn't reply. Not because I was indifferent or cruel, but because I knew something now that I hadn't fully understood before, that forgiveness, real forgiveness, doesn't always come with reconciliation. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is walk away from someone who keeps mistaking your loyalty for permission to hurt you. I never confronted my mother. I never delivered some triumphant monologue or demanded the apologies I knew she didn't know how to give. I let her unravel at her own pace, let her wrestle with the silence I had given her not as punishment, but as a mirror. And the truth is, I don't know what she saw in that mirror. Maybe she saw a daughter she underestimated. Maybe she saw her own reflection fading behind the choices she had clung to for too long. Maybe she saw nothing at all. But I saw everything. And I realized, with a clarity I had never had before, that I had never lived in my sister's shadow. I had been the light all along. I just stopped pointing it at people who couldn't see me.